Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. One of the secrets to solving Canada's productivity problem is by creating companies that scale up from startup to world class. But to solve the productivity problem, we have to solve the scale-up problem. By one metric, Canada has the lowest number of manufacturing companies in the OECD. Meet Charles Plant, serial entrepreneur, innovation economist, and the founder of the Narwhal project, aimed at helping companies reach the Canadian version of unicorn status, a billion-dollar valuation. He is the author of The Missing Ingredient, Solving Canada's Shortcomings in Growing Large Firms and Increasing Productivity. He joins us now. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Michael.
Canada has a problem scaling up companies, and it's been like that for decades now. What do you attribute the problem to?
Well, you can go back 50 years and looking at this problem. In fact, every now and then the Globe publishes another article saying, we're failing at scaling companies, we're not solving the productivity problem, anything like that. And they keep thinking that it's something to do with research and development, but it's not. We're doing enough research and development. What we're not doing a good job of is marketing and sales. And there are a number of interrelated problems that relate back to marketing and sales that make us poor at scaling companies to world-class status.
All right, so then let's start by defining some terms. You define a company that's scaling up to be one that has acquired outside capital. How does that help us understand the problem of scaling up as it relates to sales and marketing?
Well, I use it as a way of being able to separate the ones that are pre-scaling versus the ones that are scaling. So I take an amount of capital, let's say of $10 million, and say everything above that is a company that is scaling, and everything below that is a company that's getting ready to scale. It's just a way of separating different groups within the population. Fundamentally, it's very difficult to scale without capital. It's one of the things that is required. And so being able to use that as a metric to find the companies that are scaling is particularly useful. It's also available in places like Crunchbase and PitchBook and CB Insights. So you can find all sorts of data on these companies through those sources.
Now, you write that in order to scale effectively, companies need access to capital, but to markets and personnel. Are Canadians just not good at entering new markets? What is it about our inability to sell ourselves?
Well, I'm not sure. There are a number of interrelated factors there. But in Canada, we have, an oligopolistic economy. There isn't a high degree of competition between firms within Canada. If you look at Canada as a whole, there's one zone of 40 million people, but effectively that's three different zones. And the largest zone is Ontario with maybe 16 million people. So, if you're sitting in Ontario, doing business in Quebec is more difficult because of the language difference, and doing business in BC and Alberta is difficult because of the time and distance involved. So we don't have an economic zone that's really large enough to create or foster competition. If you look at the U.S., they've got 7 economic zones with more than 30 million people. If you look at Europe, you can look at any country, a major country in Europe, and they've got 30 million people. So they can foster the competition internally that creates the demand for innovation and that creates the need for being good at sales and marketing. And those two things go together. Because if you don't have a high degree of competition, you don't create the innovative products. And if there isn't a high degree of supply to the market, then you don't create good conditions for learning about sales and marketing. So that's what we face in Canada. We face situations where we don't have the opportunity because of the structure of the economy to get good at sales and marketing, to understand the needs of clients and get good at approaching.
What then of the brain drain? Do you still see that as a thing?
That's been talked about many times, and I don't see it as a thing in terms of STEM careers. There are all sorts of stats you can look at. It's something people like to talk about, to blame things on, that the Americans are stealing our people. In terms of STEM type of talent, the talent is stolen to some degree, but the amounts are declining and have been declining for years. We lose fewer and fewer people to the United States in particular because we have the companies here doing research and development that's really good. So people have an opportunity to build a career here. Now we also have the benefit of being able to attract people externally. So if there is a brain movement, it's in Canada's favor because we're able to recruit from around the world, where the US has difficulties because of their immigration system. So we really have a brain gain in Canada in STEM careers. But if you look at sales and marketing, we actually do have a brain drain. There are more opportunities for sales and marketing positions in the US than there are in Canada. Canadian firms typically are translators of American policies. So if you go work for a Google or Apple or someone like that, you're not building new strategies for accessing a market or new products. You're translating American strategies. So for a really good sales and marketing person, the opportunities aren't in Canada. They're south of the border, but they are in technical terms. We don't have an influx of sales and marketing people from external, from other countries, whereas we do have an influx in R&D people from other countries. So overall, we've got a brain drain that's different than what people really think it is. It's not a STEM brain drain. It's a marketing and sales brain drain that we're experiencing.
As part of that brain drain of STEM that we were also worried about in the 90s and into the 2000s, an ancillary sort of comment came out of that, which was that, to your point about brain gain, is a lot of Canadians who found themselves in the United States find themselves coming back to Canada as well. Is that also just a STEM phenomenon, or can we start to re-import some American-style showmanship when it comes to the marketing and the sales side of our absence in the Canadian market?
Well, there's an interesting question there because I don't see, besides anecdotally, a number of people coming back, Canadians coming back. If you're down in the U.S. and you've got a good career, you're earning a lot of money and you're paying lower taxes. You have better opportunities for your career down there, even in technical fields. So, there are people coming back, but very few and far between. The idea in STEM is, we can create opportunities for people here in R&D, but it's difficult to create them in sales and marketing. You really have to do your sales and marketing, or your market is. And our markets aren't in Canada. So it's silly to try and bring people back from San Francisco and New York to come and sell to San Franciscans and New Yorkers out of Toronto. I'll just leave them there and hire them where they are and don't make them come back. They earn more money, they have better career opportunities, and will do a better job because they're in the markets they're serving. Let's stop trying to build marketing and sales here. Let's build it elsewhere.
I'm feeling a little confused. I feel like we've got sort of a bifurcation of this conversation because we spent so much time talking about your science, technology, engineering, and maths. But your report focuses on manufacturing companies. It shows OECD nations like the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Slovak Republic. They're at the top. Canada, the US, the UK, near the bottom. Why are we comparing Western information technology economies with emerging and developing economies, which are typically more industrial?
Well, I'm just using that as one data point. The data point there is manufacturing firms. It's difficult to get other data points about this to look at large skills companies. I've looked at it from the Fortune 2000 and correlated the number of Fortune 2000 companies with productivity, and I see the same thing there. But you have in many of these countries a concentration of large firms instead of lots of little firms that's creating the differences. That's just more of an anecdote anyway in the whole story. I think the bigger story is, what are we doing about creating large multinational companies, whether they're manufacturing or technology or whatever, retail even. I mean, name a major Canadian retailer internationally. Yeah, you can do one or two, but then you can name dozens that have gone south of the border and failed abysmally.
Let's sort of expand on the brain drain gain component of this, because the report points out that the higher productivity produces more goods and services with fewer resources, and that for business, that increased productivity increases profits. The report also points out that it can result in higher wages. But even with the 1,200% profit growth we've seen in corporate EBITDA since 1979, we haven't seen wages come anywhere near matching that kind of growth. What role has this disconnect played in the difficulty in finding and retaining talent?
I'm not sure that the two things are created. I mean, are related. We've got an overall productivity problem that is improved with the creation of larger firms, because larger firms do more with less. So there is higher productivity. But, I'm in particular, I look at the technology fields, and they aren't noted for the degree of profitability. So, well, what you haven't done in that formula in your head is say, do we have commensurate gains in revenue with productivity, or is revenue increasing faster than productivity? And it could be that for firms themselves, the revenue is increasing faster than productivity, in which case there aren't the funds to go for increased wages for the masses of employees.
But isn't that very common in the tech space, where there is more of a focus on revenue growth than profit growth or productivity growth?
Well, yeah, ultimately have to drive profits and ultimately have to drive productivity, but the markets reward high revenue growth. If you're boosting revenue above 60-70% a year, then you're getting a revenue multiple that's so high that you're better not to try and get profits, because it's very difficult to grow at 70% a year and be profitable. Maybe some companies manage to do it, but it's exceedingly rare.
So if your report concludes that Ottawa focuses too much on R&D and not enough on resources, experience, and the talent needed for commercialization, how should the Canadian government foster the resources for scalable companies?
Well, I think we've got to go back and look at all the programs that are offered by Ottawa. We've got SHRED, Scientific Research and Experimental Development, that comes out of the Department of Finance. It's not even linked in with ISED, Innovation, Science and Economic Development's department spending. And there is no control of ISED over Finance Department's SHRED money. So Finance Department has determined that, we really want to give Canadians credit for doing R&D, and they put massive amounts of money, $5 billion or something like that, into SHREDs. But really, the disconnect there is that they're putting it into small firms that are improving productivity internally instead of developing new products. It's the development of new products that fosters the high degree of growth that's necessary to create the larger firms and to create the greater productivity in the country. So it's a misalignment of resources in towards R&D in the SHRED program. And then the same's occurring in ISED, because in ISED, they tend to favor programs that involve R&D and intellectual property, because there's a long-standing belief in Canada that if you build a better mousetrap, they will come. And you can see this going back article after article in paper after paper for 75 years, because I've gone back and looked at some of these articles, and they all say the same thing. Canada's got a new program in R&D because we fail in developing the productivity levels that other countries managed to do. And the two seem to be connected inexorably, because there's a lack of understanding that it's not R&D that drives large firms, it's sales and marketing.
But then how should governments fuel the demand for experience and talent? I can imagine it's relatively simple to throw a ton of money under a label of research and development and try to come up with something good with it. But how do you throw money at creating the next great salesperson?
Well, you don't really need to. And that's the great thing. I mean, I'm not advocating the government spend more money on us. In fact, they could probably spend less and do better. And that's the conundrum, in that they're spending resources with no connection of the resources to the results they're getting. They don't have in their objectives a set of results that is measurable to enable them to determine whether the work they've done is effective or not. So if you look at the money that's being spent on R&D programs to provide funding for employees, if you have an attitude that is more marketing and sales oriented, you really don't need to be spending money on those people, except maybe helping Canadians enter export markets more effectively. They just need to get us out of our heads in Canada, stop trying to start businesses in Canada, and push people to starting the sales and marketing in the markets that are going to come to make them great companies in the long run.
So the secret is throwing more money at the idea of giving Canadian companies a platform on the world stage, as opposed to giving them enough money to make the next mousetrap.
Yes, exactly. We've tried the mousetrap approach for a long time. That's all we've done for 50 to 75 years, is pour money into R&D, and we still have the same results. I mean, it's astounding that no one says, we must be doing something wrong if we're putting all this money in and we're not getting the results. It's questionable if the people there are actually spending time looking at what they're doing and trying to correlate their action with results, because they're not seeing it on the world stage. So we don't need to throw money at the problem. We need an attitudinal change, number one, which is we drive big business by export. Number two, we need an attitudinal change that says, let's focus on sales and marketing instead of R&D as the big driver of success. And we can actually reduce the funding of R&D and probably do quite well with small changes to programs like helping people export.
South Korea, Ireland, Turkey, Finland, Japan. They're the top 5 OECD countries in growth in GDP per hour worked. Can we learn from those jurisdictions?
Well, we can learn from Ireland very well because they changed the tax system and had all sorts of head offices moving there. And they do, it's a way of reporting revenue in Ireland that gets taxed in Ireland when they work as actually done in Ireland. You can learn from Japan and South Korea and companies and countries like that very well. They look at export markets. They have, fortunate to them, enough population inside those countries to foster the competition internally to drive new product development. And that's one thing Canada will never have. We have, I think Ontario would need to double in size to create an economic zone of greater than 30 million people. And that seems to be what my analysis shows as a necessary size to get to create the competition and things. So can we learn from them? Yeah, but not exactly what they've done. I think it's better to look at Israel and to see what Israel has done effectively, because they're a very small country. I mean, 7 million people. And there really isn't a market right next door for them. But what the Israelis do is that the minute they start an office in Boston or New York to do the selling in North America, because they know they have to succeed in an export market, not an internal one. They do a good job of supporting companies internally, but attitudinally they are export focused.
As the founder of the Narwhal project, let's bring it back home. What companies in Canada do you see scaling effectively today?
Well, it's great because I've been looking at this and tracking the companies in Canada for 6 or 7 years. And 6 years ago, the darlings in Canada were D2L. Shopify. Shopify is the only one that really pulled it out of the ballpark. There are a few others, like D2L was one that was going to be really successful. They managed to go public. But there's a real group of them now sitting that are not public, and they're sitting on the Narwhal list. And they're companies like Hopper that are doing exceedingly well and growing quickly and raising money and driving towards world-class status. They've been delayed a little because we had a bit of a problem in the public markets lately, and so their ability to go public and acquire capital. And it's more than just money. It's the ability to buy other companies with public shares. So we've got a group of them there. If you look at that group, what's really interesting is that they all tend to have large American backers. And so they're getting knowledge about how to grow from their predominantly US-based investors. And there's a really interesting differentiation that you can see in the companies that have been financed in Canada alone versus the companies that have been financed only with external capital. The ones with external capital are growing at twice the rate as the ones that have internal capital. So there's the secret sauce to our success, I think, in the last 5 years has been the increased amount of external capital available to Canadians from the US and other foreign investors.
Charles, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
It's been really enjoyable. Thanks for connecting.
Charles Plants is a serial entrepreneur. He is the author of The Missing Ingredient, Solving Canada's Shortcomings in Growing Large Firms and Increasing Productivity, and the founder of the Narwhal Project. Still to come from the CD Howe Institute, September 12th, a roundtable luncheon with General Wayne Eyre, the Chief of the Defence Staff of Canada. And September 26, Code Blue, Dr. Bob Bell and John Yip diagnose the problems with Ontario's healthcare system. Visit cdhow.org for more information. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to the C.D. Howe Institute podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. The C.D. Howe Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research institute whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. The Institute is widely considered to be Canada's most influential think tank and a trusted source of essential policy intelligence, distinguished by nonpartisan, evidence-based research and subject to definitive expert review. Visit cdhow.org and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you.